Deadly protests spread. Demonstrators burn hijabs in Iran after 22-year-old woman dies in custody of morality police. This was published on September 21st, 2022 from CBSNews.com. I wanted to cover this story because I'm a Muslim or Muslim adjacent, Muslim-ish, depending on how I feel that day, but I'll always identify with the Islamic religion. And I've always been interested in Iran's history. I'm not a fan of their government per se or a fan of their regime, but a lot of how their regime came to power is, of course, due to Western influence. I mean, we all know the story. MI6 and the CIA planned to overthrow their first democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, who planned to nationalize the Iranian oil fields. Then we get the Shah of Iran, who was a corrupt dictator. And then we have their Islamic Revolution, which led to Khomeini coming to power, and now this repressive Islamic fascist regime, which is now in place. Now, I'm not trying to place all the blame on Iran of today on the West fault. West, I hate that term, but of course, Iran has its own culture, its religious background, its own history, of course, that goes back thousands of years, which made it the country it is today. But the fact that we have this country in the Middle East that is, so repressive to its citizens, especially its women, is has a lot to do with what happened in the last century from Western influence. But I don't want to just give a history lesson. I want to read this story because it's actually fascinating, and I actually have some of the video. This is from Frida Gittis from Twitter, and she wrote here, "The scenes in Iran are astonishing. How far will these protests go?" Here's the video. So as you saw in the video, there was a fire, and there were many people clapping and cheering on as these women burned their hijabs in Iran. Something that I thought I would never see, but hey, anything is possible, right? A few years ago, the whole world was on one knee for Black Lives Matter. For once, the whole world cared about black people, right? So I was surprised to see that happen. So I guess anything could happen, right? The only thing I have yet to see is a unified Korea. That's probably my only dream, right? But let's read the article. Protests have spread across Iran over the death of Masa Amini after the young woman was arrested by morality police, with at least 8 people killed in a crackdown, according to a combined toll. Public anger has flared in the Islamic Republic since authorities on Friday announced the death of 22-year-old Amini, who had been held for allegedly wearing a hijab headscarf in an improper way. Activists said the woman, whose Kurdish first name is Gina, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, had suffered a fatal blow to the head, a claim denied by officials who have announced an investigation. Now, some people might come on my channel for the first time and see this video and wonder why this black American man is talking about this, little Kurdish Iranian girl who was killed by police. As a black American, I have automatic sympathy for people who are oppressed anywhere in the world. And with this revolutionary mind state, I not only view the fight and struggle against white supremacy in America as the foremost duty of a black American who's politically minded and hoping to change the world, but we also have to fight against all forms of oppression for all groups of people. And I hope that by showing my humanity, by caring about this situation for these people in Iran, the women of Iran who are held and oppressed, that the whole world can have sympathy for what black Americans and black people go through throughout the world. We are all one human race, and I'm not just bringing up race in this case to talk about what black people go through, but we are all one human race, and we should all care about each other. What people are going through in Iran also relates to what people are going through in America and everywhere in the world where there is oppression, violence, fascism, and just brutal repression against people's free will. I'll continue reading. Some women demonstrators have definitely taken off their hijabs and burned them in bonfires or symbolically cut their hair before cheering crowds. Video footage spread virally on social media has shown. These are some of the pictures of scenes in Iran. No to the headscarf, no to the turban, yes to freedom and equality. Protesters in Tehran were heard chanting in a rally that has been echoed by solidarity protests abroad, including in New York and Istanbul. Iranian state media reported on Wednesday that in a fifth night of street rallies that had spread to 15 cities, police used tear gas and made arrests to disperse crowds of up to 1,000 people. Now, I want to say that, most of the time when countries have large protests, and by the way, the mainstream media in the West might be blowing these protests out of proportion because they have a vested interest in trying to see the Iranian regime discredited or to try to always stoke or promote what they call democratic movements or democratic revolutions in countries because they don't like the regime at the top. Meanwhile, if another country did that to the U.S. or any other Western nation, right, if China was trying to provoke or stoke, separatist tensions in Spain, or if they were trying to promote a regime change in France or in the U.S., we would have a fit, right? But we always try to, mess with the Iranian people, fund their separatist movements or regime change organizations. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that this media might be blowing this out of proportion, but anytime you do see mass movements in the streets, it comes down to economics, right? It comes down to economic reasons. People ain't got jobs. Inflation is going crazy. Everywhere you go in the world right now, if you talk to people, everybody is saying the same three things. They hate their president, everything is expensive, and it's hard to get a job or keep a job, right? This is what everybody in the world is going through right now. And I'm sure in Iran it's even worse because they're under heavy critical, crucial sanctions from the West. So I'm sure, if you think inflation is high in the U.S. or any country where you're watching this in, imagine what it's like in Iran. I'm pretty sure it's balls to the wall there. All right, I'll continue reading. London based rights group Article 19 said it was deeply concerned by reports of the unlawful use of force by Iranian police and security forces, including the use of live ammunition. Demonstrators hurled stones at security forces, set up fire to police vehicles and garbage bins, and chanted anti government slogans, the official IRNA news agency said, adding that rallies were held in cities including Mashhad, Tabriz, Isfahan, and Shiraz. Death to the dictator and women, life, freedom protesters could be heard shouting in video footage that spread beyond Iran, despite online restrictions reported by Internet access monitor NetBlocks. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei spoke publicly on Wednesday, but without mentioning the spreading unrest, and the ultra-conservative President Ibrahim Raisi was to address the UN General Assembly in New York later in the day. I want to say that Iran probably has a high level of educated people, people with a lot of degrees, or people who have spent years in college and then they can't find a job. And that is a dangerous mix to have. A society where there are no jobs and you have a lot of educated people or people who have traveled outside of their country and come back. You can't repress someone who just went to Germany and got their dick sucked in a hostel, right? You can't tell some girl, she has to put a hijab when she just got her back blown out when she went to Canada and her hair was getting pulled and all sorts of stuff. I don't mean to be crass here, but I'm just saying, like, when you have information, when you have educated people or people who have had experiences outside of their country, you can't come and repress them. Now, you might have a bunch of people who are ignorant and a bunch of people who are, tied into the regime's motives, but you can't always repress people, especially if they're very highly educated. And I think the Iranian government, and I might just be pontificating here, but I think the Iranian government promoted higher education for a lot of people, and I think it's fairly cheap to get there. And so I think there are a lot of people who are overly educated and don't have a lot of opportunity, which is a recipe for disaster, right? And in a lot of places in the world, actually, more women are getting higher education degrees than men. I know this for a fact. Statistically, in the US, more women graduate from college than men, right? Like, I'm a minority for men, right? A man with a college degree, a black man with a college degree, right? There are not that many in the US. The majority of people who earn degrees in the US, at least, are white women, right? And so I think the same follows in most other countries, right? And I think that would also include Iran. So you have educated women who have, learned all sorts of outside knowledge, and now they're, revolting against the system. Now, but I'm not saying that this is widespread or as big as it is. It's just something to think about. I'll continue. Societal crisis. The wave of protests over Amini's death is a very significant shock. It is a societal crisis, said Iran expert David Rigolet Rose of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. It is difficult to know the outcome, but there is a disconnect between the authorities with their DNA of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and an increasingly secularized society, he said. It is a whole social project that is being called into question. There is a hesitation among the authorities on the way forward with regard to this movement. The New York based Center for Human Rights in Iran described her death as a preventable tragedy. Mahsa Amini is one of among countless victims of the Islamic Republic's war on women, said Hadi Gaimi, the group's executive director. She was arrested under the guise of the state's forced hijab law and died shortly after. The government is responsible for her death and decades of women being harassed, detained, and otherwise harmed under the guise of this discriminatory, inhuman law. So I want to comment here. I said at the beginning that I'm not a fan of the Iranian government, but I have to preface also or add that I'm not a fan of any government actually at all. I think all governments, all nations are naturally repressive, and we would do better living in a world that was globalized and borderless. I'll be frank. I'm a border. I'm your worst nightmare, right? For anybody who's of the right watching this, or is not as far left as me. But I'll say this: as a Muslim, right? I guess it can be questioned: how can I reconcile being Muslim or follow or upholding Islamic ideals or thinking that Islamic ideals are the best with also my views on, state repression, right? Or what the state's role is in our society. And Islam is unique compared to other religions is that Islam comes with how can I say this, parameters or guides on how to run a society. It's the only religion, at least as far as I know, that comes with actual rules on how to guide a society or a framework for guiding society. Christianity doesn't have that. There's no such thing as Christian Sharia. Maybe the Jews have that to some extent, but Islam is very explicit in this, right? And I would just say that I am I believe that Islam is a personal matter, right? Islam is something that you have within your heart, and you follow the Sharia as you see it, right? I'm not a sheikh, I'm not an alim, I'm not a scholar, but I think this is the only way we can reconcile having Islam in the world and also Islam in society. I do not think that a Sharia in public, right, is the way to organize our society today because it's almost impossible. It's impossible to guarantee that the sheikhs and alims and the scholars and the legal jurists who will be the leaders of a hypothetical Islamic state will be able to interpret the law in a way that is not repressive, if that makes sense. If you want to follow the Sharia, you follow the Sharia, but you cannot make other people do it. And for anybody who's going to say this is haram, this is blasphemy, or anything like that, in Islam for thousands of years, for the first 1,000 years, for the majority of time Islam has been around, slavery was legal. Slavery was legal from the beginning of Islam up until I would say the mid 20th century. And then all of a sudden, when the rest of the world decided that slavery is, hey, really bad and we shouldn't do the slavery stuff, then the Islamic scholars and the alims all decided, you know what? Yeah, we can, fudge the rules and come up with new fatwas to now say slavery is totally forbidden in Islam, even though in the Quran explicitly it says slavery is allowed, and these are the rules for following slavery, right? But now having slaves is considered haram by most reputable Islamic scholars. So don't come to me with all this stuff like it says in the Quran this and we need to follow the Sharia that, because when it was time to actually do something about something very heinous and horrible, which is slavery and which has often affected black people, right? Now the Islamic scholars can say, okay, we can find a way to make the Quran work with us in this way to make this not allowed. So we can do the same thing by still allowing Islam to exist, but not allowing the worst elements of it to be in charge of governing our society and our lives. It's impossible. It's impossible to make this work as it is, right? And I'm not wishing for the downfall of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I just want reform. I just want people to be happy, to be safe, to be free. That's all. All people. All people. Protests first erupted Friday in Amini's home province of Kurdistan, where Governor Ismail Zari Kusha said Tuesday 3 people had been killed in a plot by the enemy. Kurdistan Police Commander Ali Azadi on Wednesday announced the death of another person, according to Tasnim news agency. 2 more protesters were killed during the riots in Kermanshah province. The region's prosecutor Shahram Karami was quoted as saying by Fars news agency, blaming counter-revolutionary agents. Additionally, the Norway-based Kurdish rights group Henga said 2 protesters aged 16 and 23 had been killed overnight in West Azerbaijan province. An additional 450 people have been wounded and 500 arrested, the group said, figures that could not be independently verified. Video spread online showing security forces opening fire on protesters in the southern city of Shiraz, where protests continued into the early hours of the morning. Amini's death and Iran's response to the protests have sparked condemnation from the United Nations, United States, France, and other countries. The protests are among the most serious in Iran since November 2019 unrest over fuel price rises. So I just wish that the United Nations, France, and all the other, very powerful nations at the in the congregations of nations of the world condemn the United States whenever they have state-sponsored harassment of its population, right? But we can always pick on Iran. I'm not saying that Iran is exempt from criticism, but we need to have the same criticism across the board, right? As China locks up Uyghurs, as the U.S. continues to do horrible things to its minority populations, and other countries around the world which do not treat segments of their society right. We need to have condemnation against that. We need to speak up against that. And we need to advocate for freedom, justice, and peace. Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani on Tuesday condemned what he called foreign interventionist positions. It is regrettable that some countries try to take advantage of an incident under investigation as an opportunity to pursue their political goals and desires against the government and people of Iran, he said. Iran's telecommunications minister Issa Zarapur on Wednesday warned of internet restriction, citing the security issues of these days, ISNA news agency said. Article 19 said it was alarmed by the local internet shutdowns, recalling that in 2019, authorities had used the darkness of a shutdown to kill, maim, and arrest protesters and bystanders with impunity. And that's the end of the article. So, once again, I hope that there's justice for this woman who was killed illogically. I hope that the Islamic countries of the world, who are very strict and follow the Sharia, find a way to reform their societies to make it equitable for women. We can't live in the 21st century, and in some countries, women don't have the right to drive, don't have the right to own their own businesses, buy their own homes, rent their own apartments, wear what they want, and that sort of thing. That's not fair. It's not fair. Nobody would want their daughter to live like that. But also in the Western world, we don't need to have this holier than thou criticism of Islamic countries when so many people in Western countries, specifically America, want to follow the principles or follow the way of the most crazy, radical, religious Islamic extremists. For all these people who are pro-life and pro-gun and all this sort of stuff, you are very similar to the Taliban, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to the worst elements of the Islamic societies that you judge and look your nose down upon. So what I'm trying to say is that everywhere in the world there is injustice against women. There's injustice against minorities. There's injustice against the people who society views as powerless, right? But we need to speak up for these people. We need to advocate for them. And I hope there is justice for Mahsa Amini. My name is Simon Hill, and thank you for watching.